What is up, podheads? Today we have the DC Audio 65CX, a very nice coaxial speaker, Neo motor, kind of water resistant thing. Very lightweight, coming in at $300 a pair and 100 watts RMS. Let's see how this speaker performs. So in order to limit the low end distortion of this speaker, I set a high pass crossover of 112 hertz. Overall frequency response is pretty smooth in the mid-range. There is a large dip here at 1200 hertz, but the tweeter response stays fairly flat. It's pretty well maintained. The speaker plays, I'd say, fairly well from 150 hertz all the way up to about 18K. It requires only a fraction of a watt in order to reach 90 decibels. Frequency response at that moderate listening volume is pretty well maintained. That's pretty nice. Mid-range response is fairly flat. However, there is that large dip at 1200 hertz, but the tweeter response stays pretty good. Distortion at 90 decibels stays very well maintained at everything under 1% throughout that listening range. In order to reach 110 decibels, it only requires 12 watts of power. This, again, is a very sensitive speaker. It gets silly loud. Frequency response for that power level seems to be about the same, stays fairly well flat throughout the mid-range frequencies. Has that large hole at 1200 hertz, and the tweeter still stays fairly well maintained. Distortion at that power level does stay pretty well under 2%. Everything above 250 hertz. Everything below that starts getting a little out of control. Giving it a little bit more power, distortion still stays fairly well maintained. But in order to play this thing at the 100 watt RMS value, I did give it a high pass crossover of 250 hertz. At 100 watts, the distortion still stays pretty well maintained at well under 10%, right around the 5% mark. And the frequency response is kind of hard to read, but giving it a 250 hertz high pass filter in order to limit the low end distortion, you're not going to get much out of it below 250 hertz. This response here, I did cross it out at 3000 hertz low pass to save the tweeter from offing itself. So the DC Audio 65CX, it's a pretty neat little speaker, very lightweight, would be good for motorcycle type applications, potentially a factory replacement type application since it is so sensitive. Overall, the frequency response is all right. There is that large dip at 1200 hertz, but the tweeter plays really nicely, fairly flat response on the high end. So overall, it's okay. Peace.